The top Ukrainian general is admitting publicly that the situation for Ukraine on the Eastern Front is deteriorating rapidly. How can Ukraine pivot in the long term to solve this problem? But what does it need in the short term? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is really probably the top story. This is the Ukrainian top commander, Syrskyi, saying, quote, "The situation on the Eastern Front has significantly deteriorated in recent days." This is, of course, we've seen an increase of Russian armored assaults. And he's made these comments April 13th, yesterday. So for context, in Ukraine, right, the spring rains really muddy up the entire area, and it makes it really hard to conduct any kind of infantry or even armored operations, right? The tracks of vehicles, wheeled vehicles, they get stuck in the mud. And what happens when you have an artillery-centric war like they do now is that that artillery will destroy the plant life and the trees in a given area. The problem with that is that those living root systems help bind the dirt together. They actually give it stability. And so if you have roadways, if you have fields that have just been turned into moonscapes, then those rains, they turn the mud into multiple feet thick of just sludge. And it can swallow up not just vehicles, but it can actually swallow up people as well. Famously, in the First World War, in some of the most brutal battles, the mud actually became a source of casualty. Soldiers would fall into mud and get sucked in and be drowned slowly in the mud. It was pretty horrific. And when you have this kind of muddy environment, right, it's going to slow combat operations considerably. But spring is turning into summer in Ukraine, and that means conditions are getting drier. They're becoming more favorable to mechanized assaults. And so we're seeing more and more Russia ramping up its offensive operations. And it seems to have a somewhat different strategy. According to this article, the dry weather, right, enabled Russia to increase its armored assaults in areas like Bakhmut, Lyman, and Pokrovsk. But what's interesting is this is part of their strategy, right? Russian forces are pursuing these three operational level efforts that are not mutually reinforcing, right? So they don't help each other. They're too far apart, but they let Russian forces make these grinding tactical gains in any one of those three sectors, right? So they can hold two and will push in one. And because the Ukrainian forces struggle to defend against these Russian efforts, it's the Ukrainian forces have to make increasingly difficult decisions, right? They can choose to try to hold some terrain in some places, but not others. They have to yield low-value terrain. They have to withdraw to better defensive positions. And now that more terrain is open to Russian tanks, and Russian forces, again, are continually regenerating their forces. They're continually mobilizing their forces, whereas the Ukrainians, they're having to dig deeper into their pool of conscripts. They're having to pivot to new strategies, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, including relying on new technologies. But the Ukrainian forces rely on chiefly aid. They need artillery shells, and they do not have them, right? The U.S. political system currently so dysfunctional that it is unable to move any kind of Ukrainian aid in any capacity through Congress at all. So I think that is sad, interesting, and emblematic of kind of failures of the U.S. foreign policy establishment, that they cannot even provide a basic level of support to U.S. allies, right? And unfortunately, because of these tremendous delays in Congress, it looks like they may not have to have these debates, right? And there's a lot of blame to go around, but it doesn't have to be this way, because here's the thing. Ukraine aid, if it passes, Ukraine will know that it doesn't have to marshal its artillery stores for right now years, right? It needs to say, okay, how do we burn our artillery at a rate that's going to let us fight for years? But once they know that aid is coming, even if it's going to take 3 months to get there, they say, great, instead of having to stretch this artillery over years, we can now burn it in 3 months. And so it's going to have immediate effect. But the aid bill has to pass. And we've talked about in other videos, we've talked about how important it is that you guys write to your congressmen, your representatives, and let them know everyone in Congress can contribute. This isn't, they love to blame one party for this. And when you look at the news, oftentimes I actually think Russian propaganda tries to blame either one party or blame the speaker himself when the situation is much more complicated. Many Democrats don't want to support the aid bill because it contains a level of military support for Israel. Many Republicans don't want to support it because they don't want to see Ukrainian aid pass until they get another crack at a border bill. You might remember the last border bill was extremely, I actually thought extremely well written and addressed chronic issues within the immigration system. And that obviously couldn't make it through. But almost everybody has a role here. Including the speaker, right? And so, but every member of the House can be pressured to support moving this aid bill or another comparable aid bill through Congress. And the fact is that, I have gripes with the way the U.S. supports its allies, but the Ukrainians are pivoting to another strategy themselves, right? And the Ukrainian MOD admits that they have to, basically, this war has to look more and more Skynet. Right? Now, what do I mean by this? Well, we've seen that on the battlefield now, a lot of the footage we've looked at on Combat Vet News, for example, we've seen that a lot of times the attacking and defending forces never get within visual range of each other, right? And this has been the case in naval warfare for almost 100 years, but now it's been increasingly the case in ground warfare, where these forces are attack each other with drones and artillery, that having individual weapon systems is almost perfunctory. And Ukraine, because it's short on people and munitions, needs to become more technologically sophisticated in the drones it deploys. And we're seeing more and more AI-guided drones. So instead of having one soldier guiding one drone, you might have a dozen drones guarded by or directed by a simple AI, having them seek out Russian targets that have been either pre-selected or pre-tagged by a human observer. So drones already seem to be close to outnumbering soldiers on the battlefield. And each one of those drones replaces a soldier or a team of soldiers, right? If you have an anti-armor FPV drone, that replaces an entire anti-armor team. We've also seen, of course, Ukrainian drones that not just fly, but also roll on the ground, as we've seen some of their modified ATVs. We've seen them provide fire support, and it's a real sign that the Ukrainian forces have realized they can't sustain this fight without additional, they need additional manpower, but they have to find ways to make that manpower stretch further. But again, these are things that are years away, right? And that's the problem, right? Europe has sworn up and down it's going to try to get Ukraine a lot of artillery and other military aid in the next 2 years. Ukraine's going to pivot its own defense industrial base and ramp that up, again, in a period measured in years. But they need a solution for the next weeks and months. And there's only one country on earth that is able and willing to provide that aid, and it's the United States, right? And this is what happens when you spend, 80 years of the global order, 50 years, where the global order simply defers to the United States. They say, you know what? Us Europeans, we have very expensive social programs, so we're just going to keep our military spending very low, and we're going to have the United States function as the world's arsenal, the world's defender of all the countries, right? Every democracy in Asia, every democracy in Europe is defended by the United States and the United States military. And you can't run. And now we're seeing those decisions come home to roost, right? Because now that the U.S. government is unable to provide that military assistance in the timely manner it's needed, Europe says, wow, we literally don't have the factories. We literally don't have the munitions to provide this aid. Europeans would love to. They just can't. They physically can't, right? They cannot conjure an artillery shell out of nothing. They have to manufacture it, and they can't. So again, everyone, it feels like, is doing their part, except, of course, for the U.S. Congress. Anyway, guys, if you want to be more effective at your job, unlike Congress, right, maybe I'll send Congress some strike gum, right? Maybe that'll give them the energy they need to get their heads on straight. It has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece and 100 milligrams alpha GPC for further cognitive enhancement. This idea sounds less and less bad. I wonder if I could just send this to Mike Johnson and be like, courtesy of the Ukrainians. It's got zero sugar, all the caffeine of a Red Bull. And, we're on Amazon now. So check us out, strikegum.com. This is where you can get all the discounts for military and veteran and first-time customer. But, if you're somebody who's got an Amazon account, go to amazon.com, search for Strike Gum, and check it out. And thanks to the dozens of people who've left us 5-star reviews. We really appreciate it. And of course, a huge thank you to all the members of combatvetnews.com. You guys really are the ones who enable me to continue to do this every day. I appreciate all you guys, and I'll see you all in the next one. Cheers.